All right, so we're going to start off here with 15.3. We're going to talk about imperialism, European imperialism in the Muslim world. So in 15.3, we'll look at how both internal and external pressures shaped the Muslim world during this time. And again, we're talking this age of imperialism, 1800 to just before World War I. Specifically, we'll look at, in this section, the challenges faced by the Ottoman Empire and also Persia, or as we had called this region before, the Safavid Empire, and now it will be the Qajar leadership. We'll also look specifically at Egypt, which had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and as it tries to update and modernize, and we'll look at how the opening of the Suez Canal plays into that effort. If you remember back in the late 1790s, when Napoleon had his unsuccessful campaign against the British or in Egypt, trying to stymie the British who had some presence there. Although he was unsuccessful, it did highlight for most of the powers in Europe the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Now, we talked about the empire declining over a very long period of time, but Napoleon's campaign in Egypt kind of marks the beginning of an increased presence for the European powers with the Ottoman Empire, again, highlighting its ongoing weakness and decline. Up to this point, European countries had just established footholds around the edges of Muslim countries. Before long, again, in the interest of imperialism, they're going to strike at the heartland and in many cases dominate both the political, economic, and social situation in these territories. So looking at the map again, these are, in this section and the next section, the three Muslim empires we'll be talking about. So in the orange, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire in India, and in the purple, the region of Persia or the Safavid Empire. Now, as we mentioned, there's a number of internal and external factors. We're going to focus first on the internal factors, and these are ones that were common for each of these three regions. Increased power for the nobles, increased power in the military elites, and the urban craft guilds all came at the expense of leadership. In each of these empires, corruption as time went on was increasingly widespread. And in some parts of these empires, the scholars and religious leaders supported the state, but in other places they tried to stir things up against the government. And each of these three empires faced increasing competition from the industrialized, the strengthened powers in Europe. Now, in each of these regions, there were groups that tried to reform the empires. And if you go back to the beginning section in this unit, trying to strengthen their ability to resist. In this case, with these reform movements stressing piety, strict rules for behavior, basically going back to the basics of Islam. In northern Africa, we had the French taking over Algeria, so we have Ousmane Dan Fodio fighting against the French, trying to reform and strengthen his followers in Muslim practices in northern Africa. In the Sudan to the east, just to the south of Egypt, we had a leader, Muhammad Ahmad, who claimed to be the Mahdi. And the Mahdi in the Islamic faith is the long-awaited savior. So he claimed to be the Mahdi. And there are still those in the Sudan region today that believe in the idea of the Mahdi. In Arabia, so the Arabian Peninsula or Saudi Arabia today, we had a movement that, again, was a get back to the basics, fundamental movement, going back to the purity and the simplicity of Islam in the days of Muhammad. That's called the Wahhabi movement. And the Wahhabi movement still has a significant presence and dominates the type of Islam that is practiced in Saudi Arabia. So again, each of these trying to strengthen based on their faith to resist European influence. And again, each of these rejected the Western ways, rejected the influence of the West. So let's focus on the Ottoman Empire. So if you remember, the Ottoman Empire at its peak under Suleiman covered all the lands, both in the green and the shades of purple. So at its peak, a significant empire. You can see over time it gets smaller to the point where at the end of the Age of Imperialism, just before the First World War, it is going to be primarily just the eastern coast of the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and modern-day Syria and Turkey. So much smaller than it was before. So the Ottomans faced significant internal challenges within their empire. Now remember, they're covering so much territory, so they've got a lot of different groups of people, different cultures, different languages, and as we talked about it with the millets, different religions as well. So in some of these regions, especially in the Balkans region, so if you look just to the north of where the word Mediterranean Sea is there, where it says Belgrade, Sofia, in those areas, that's the Balkans region. There were revolts there against Ottoman rule. In Egypt, there was revolts as well, to the point where Egypt at some point a little bit later is basically going to be a semi-autonomous region. And in all of these areas, all the territory covered by the Ottoman Empire, the local leaders or the pashas grew more and more bold and more willing to go against the leadership coming out of Istanbul. And at the same time, the Ottoman Empire is facing external pressures from increasingly industrialized European powers. So the Russians want part of the Ottoman Empire. The Germans want part of the Ottoman Empire. The British certainly do, and the French as well. They all recognize that the Ottoman Empire is in decline, and they want to capitalize on that weakness. So again, looking at our map, the French looking to take territory from the Ottoman Empire in North Africa. The Russians looking to take what are called the Bosporus Straits and the Dardanelles, those tight waterways that go right past Istanbul and connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if you think about it, Russia is just to the northeast of those two red circles, and before I give you the answer, think to yourself, why would Russia want to gain control of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Straits? So if you were thinking that they wanted access to the Mediterranean Sea, you would be correct. So that's what they were looking for. The Germans as well had an interest, and the Germans were looking to build a railway that extended from Berlin down through Ottoman territory to the Middle East. So external pressures to take parts of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman rulers tried to institute reforms in the late 1700s. Again, they didn't just give up. They didn't just recognize their decline and turn things over. They improved and reformed the bureaucracy of the government. They made the tax system more efficient. They expanded education, making it more available to more citizens. They brought in Europeans to help train their military and to advise on training and technology. They sent their young men to the West for education, both in technology and in science. Again, looking to internally strengthen their position. But these reforms didn't always help. Maybe had the best intentions, but weren't always a positive result. For example, as science improved in the Ottoman Empire, as food production improved, well, it brought on a population explosion. And as we talked about before, when the population grows, you're going to have increased competition for land, for people to live, for people to work, and to grow food for those people. Many of the local sultans objected to bringing in any Western ideas, even if it is science and technology, that might threaten their control on things. It might threaten their control on power. And in the 1890s, we do have a group of young reformers called the Young Turks. And these Young Turks were very nationalistic in their minds. So again, nationalism, that word we talked about since the age of Napoleon. So pushing for more openness, pushing for more liberal reform in the name of a Turkish state. They actually got to the point where they overthrew the Sultan, but then, as we'll see in a number of places, World War I comes into the picture and kind of puts a stop on any of the reforms that the Young Turks were looking to institute. But this movement, this tension created by these reformers, by the Young Turks, this nationalistic, proud of being Turkish, to the exclusion of some of the other ethnicities within the Ottoman Empire, exploded in this time. And it exploded relative to a group of people that lived in Armenia, which you see there in the red. Now, the Armenians, again, lived within the Ottoman Empire, but they were Christian. They were Armenian Christians. And through most of their time in the Ottoman Empire, they were allowed to do their own thing, have their own millet. If you remember our talking about the millets in Ottoman society. And Ottomans were very tolerant. But in this time of nationalism, in this time of the Ottomans facing external threats, particularly in this case from Russia, there was suspicion that the Armenians were working against the Ottomans with the Russians. So the Turks accused the Armenians of helping the Russians against the Ottomans. In fact, it is true that they would have been in favor of that, but the actions taken by the Ottoman Empire against the Armenians, forcibly putting them into camps, forcing them to march, starving them to death, resulted in what's called the Armenian Genocide. The specific numbers aren't necessarily exact, but somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died. It's a well-documented genocide, although modern-day Turkey still refuses to recognize it as a genocide. And you'll still see, even in the United States, when the Congress might try to recognize that that the Armenian genocide was a genocide, you'll see a lot of pressure from the Turkish government against the U.S. trying to recognize that. But nonetheless, most historians recognize the Armenian genocide as a genocide by the Ottomans against the Armenian Turks. Some of the orphans who survived after their parents died in the Armenian genocide. And we'll talk about this again when we get to World War I and see how that plays into the strategy of the war. So let's look specifically here at Egypt. Now, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, so arguably the governor of Egypt reported to the Sultan in Istanbul. So at this point in the early 1800s, the leader or the governor in Egypt is a man by the name of Muhammad Ali. Now, this is Muhammad Ali, the governor, not Muhammad Ali, the boxer. And he's recognized as the father of modern Egypt. Now, at this time, Egypt really was semi-autonomous. As we talked about, the Ottoman Empire is in decline. The local rulers in the far reaches of the empire have more and more power. And in this part of the world, in this part of the Ottoman Empire, Muhammad Ali had significant autonomy. He improved the tax system. He improved the land system, the land holding system, reorganized it to make it more efficient and more fair. If you're familiar at all with the geography of Egypt, a lot of it is desert. So Muhammad Ali championed large irrigation projects so that more of the land using the water from the Nile River and other rivers was able to be used for farmland. So promoting cash crops like cotton and other industries that would bring money back to Egypt. He also modernized the military to the point where he was successful militarily against what were weaker neighbors around him. So he was able to expand the territory. So again, Muhammad Ali, considered the father of modern Egypt. After Muhammad Ali, Egypt came under increasing control by foreigners. So the governors that succeeded Muhammad Ali were not nearly as strong, not nearly as successful. Now, for some time, the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptians had wanted to build a canal that connected the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. In 1858, a French entrepreneur, Ferdinand de Lesseps, organized a company to build what we know today as the Suez Canal. So work began on the Suez Canal. Egypt had to borrow a lot of money in order to finance the construction of the Suez Canal. Well, as things got more challenging, as things got more difficult, Egypt was unable to make those payments. So, opportunistic as they were, the British, the English came in and bought those loan papers, bought the mortgage, and took over control of the Suez Canal. So now Britain is going to have control of what becomes the Suez Canal. So increasing the European presence in Egypt. The canal opens up in 1869. It's about 100 miles long. Again, connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And significantly, and think about this in terms of Britain and their trade with India, which we'll talk about in the next section. But it cuts the distance between London and India by 5,000 miles. So think about how much less expensive your transportation costs for goods are going to be if you can go through the Mediterranean Sea, through the Red Sea, across the Indian Ocean to India, rather than having to sail all the way down to around the bottom of Africa and then back up to India. And it keeps Egypt right at the center of commerce, and it keeps Egypt at the crossroads of trade and global commerce. So here you can see the map, how significant that 5,000 miles is in terms of reducing transportation time and transportation costs. But it really was an engineering marvel, the Suez Canal. So by 1882, Suez Canal was built, it's in operation, it's controlled by the British. Egypt at this point pretty much is what we would call a protectorate of Britain. So here's how that works, and we've talked a little bit about these types of rules. So in theory, on paper, the governor of Egypt is an official of the Ottoman Empire and reports back to Istanbul. But in practical terms, sort of on the ground, he really follows the policies that are dictated and told to him by Britain. As a British protectorate, Egypt continued to modernize, continued to improve infrastructure, continued to play a critical role in commerce, but all through this time, again, there's that word nationalism again. The Egyptians began to resent being controlled by the British, being controlled by a foreign power. So nationalist discontent will continue, and we'll come back and touch on that a little bit later in the year. Okay, we're going to go to the east, to a region of Persia that we've talked about as the Safavid Empire back in the 1600s. When we left the Safavid Empire, we brought in the Qajars, who controlled this territory from 1794 to 1925. Like the Safavids, the Qajars exercised absolute power over the people living in their empire and their kingdom. And they too took steps to modernize, build infrastructure, railroad, telegraph, even experimenting at different times with a more constitutional style government that you might see in the West. But like we've seen in other places, these efforts to self-reform don't save them or don't protect them from the influence of the Western powers. And if you look at where they are geographically, just to the north, you've got Russia. Russia wants to protect its southern border. Britain to the east is in control of, Britain to the east is in control of India, so they want to protect their interests there as well. But the big changer in Persia, modern-day Iran, is when oil was found. Once oil was found, this is certainly something that the Western powers, the imperial powers, desired because it would fuel their machines, their boats, and other aspects of industrialization. So once oil was found, they were in a strong enough position that they were able to get concessions, favorable terms from the Qajar governments, even to the point where they were able to send their troops, European troops, into this region to protect the economic interests of England or of Britain and of Russia. Now, the Persian nationalists, again, we had nationalism in this territory as well. The Persian nationalists were split. Some desired to continue that path toward westernization, but others wanted to go in the other direction entirely, 180 degrees, and return back to that more fundamentalist Islamic law. Arguably, even in 2020 and modern-day Iran, this country, this territory, this state is still having this struggle. Are they going to be a more westernized, modern country, or are they going to operate as a theocracy as they do today? Again, that's something that we'll explore a little bit later, and certainly something we explore in other classes at UA as well.